Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Support comes from the University of Alaska College Savings Plan, helping you and your child save for college every step of the way, from diapers to diploma. More information at uacollegesavings.com.
The National Weather Service.
Happy Thursday, ladies and gentlemen. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, and you've turned into your Alaska weather. Welcome. Tonight is December 15th, 2016. As always, you can get a hold of us. 1-800-472-0391 is our 24/7 forecaster line. You can get up-to-date automated forecast or talk to someone at any time of the day or night if you'd like. You can follow us on our website, weather.gov/Alaska. I will mention that we've had some issues nationally with our website today. They're working on things back in D.C. So if you notice things are slow or not updating, there are some archive forecasts that are on there now. So just be advised if you're looking on there, some of the information might be old. So take a chance to call our number there and you'll get the latest. And then if you have any feedback or comments for the show, nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov is the email address, which we will answer your questions and your feedback. So our headlines tonight: strong bearing storms continue. If you tuned in last night, we talked quite a bit about our storms out there. We're going to have several more storms in the forecast, so we'll be watching the bearing quite closely. Warming temperatures, this is going to be the ongoing trend for the next 24 to 48 hours from west to east. So we'll talk about that for south central and southeast Alaska. And snow and mixed precipitation chances. We're definitely going to see more moisture in our atmosphere, and thus we will have more chances for snow, but with some of that warmer air, we also have more chances for freezing rain or rain-snow mix, depending on your exact location. And blowing snow continues for the west coast. Not quite as bad as it was last night, but as we get into our winter weather advisories, we do still have a few of those. None of these are for blowing snow tonight, but we do still have some pockets of blowing snow there through the Seward Peninsula down towards Hooper Bay. But these advisories are mainly for freezing rain. This one is actually expired just recently, so the freezing rain advisory down there towards Grayling and Anvik area has expired. But still on the southern end of the Seward Peninsula, freezing rain advisory in effect, less than 1/10 of an inch expected, but that is in effect for about another half hour or so until 6 p.m. Otherwise, on the advisory map, we remain clean for most part as we move into this active pattern. We'll have to keep an eye and see if that changes. So here's our first front that we're seeing start to move across. This was on the west coast last night, is now over south central, stretching up towards Fairbanks in the interior. And with that, we do have some pockets of snow and rain along the coast, but pockets of snow stretching from Anchorage all the way up to Fairbanks. And here's our big bearing storm that we talked about quite a bit last night. It continues to spread this front through St. Paul and push it to the east, and those strong winds wrapping around the backside there. We'll put that in the loop one more time here. And you can see that strong rotation right around the low just north of the western Aleutians. For southeast Alaska, it was a clear day once again with high pressure located just over the western portion of Canada. So with high pressure there, we saw more offshore flow and sky clear conditions out over much of southeast. For the front that is moving now towards the west coast, that's where we see another line of stronger winds, and we're going to be watching those to help to create those blowing snow conditions again into tonight and tomorrow. And then looking up towards the Arctic coast here, you can see some of that moisture even making its way up there. Not expecting a lot of it to make it up there. This front is falling apart as it moves across the state, but definitely the chance for snow increasing as we see a more moist pattern set up. So taking a look at that system now, it's 948 millibars, fairly strong system out there, pretty classic December low over the Bering. We do see those strong isobars moving from the south to the north, and so therefore southerly winds following along those isobars. Good packing, which means again the stronger winds because of the stronger pressure gradient. And so there's those pockets of blowing snow. And with all this warm air coming up and over the colder surfaces, especially those colder valleys and some of the snow-covered ground, you do expect some fog to develop. So fairly widespread fog all the way up towards Point Lay and Cape Lisburne up there. And there's just those few isolated snow showers that we do expect along the Arctic coast. Some snow showers over Fairbanks, and then here is the rain and the snow for the Kenai Peninsula. And this is just starting to move into the Cook Inlet region as we get into the evening hours here. Just a few flakes starting to fly around Anchorage with temperatures hovering in the mid-teens. And again, we expect that storm system to continue to work its way to the east and start to move even more moisture towards the mainland of Alaska from Bristol Bay all the way over to the Copper River Basin. Speaking of the Copper River Basin, cloud cover increased there today, but still a fairly nice day. And then those dry conditions, courtesy of our 1,034 millibar high pressure system all over western Canada. Now on into tonight's forecast. There's where we see that snow starting to set up. Mainly snow for the interior locations. As long as you're not right along the coast, it's going to be snow. We could see a little bit of a mix, some rain and snow mixing together, but for the most part, expecting this system to be enough cold air still in place over the southern portion of the state that we should see things remain all snow. Mixed precipitation, though, for parts of the Bristol Bay region from King Salmon up towards Dillingham and maybe in the Nestoy Hook area. With that, we don't expect a whole lot of freezing rain, but definitely could see some slick conditions develop. And then again, our really dominant system is out over here, 952 millibars tonight, and spreading widespread warm air surging up with this, and thus rain all the way up into the Gulf of Anadyr and into the eastern portions of Russia. Not until you get around to the back side where we have, again, we talked about those stronger winds last night, some strong winds courtesy of the cold air that's wrapping in back here, and with that colder air, we do see some rain and snow mixing together. Still fairly nice conditions, clear and probably pretty cold once again for southeast Alaska as high pressure starts to pull away from that area. On into Friday now. Again, moisture just continuing to stream up. This is the remnants of that occluded boundary we saw on the last slide. And so that's going to start to slide eastward and bring even more chances for precipitation throughout south central and throughout the Gulf regions. And this will even start to push off into southeast Alaska. So we expect conditions to deteriorate for places like White and Chilkoot Pass. Snow showers will be in the forecast for Friday for Anchorage and for areas down towards the Alaska Range, Port Ellsworth, and over towards Iliamna and Bethel. Again, expecting this to be a fairly heavy snow with conditions being in the 20s. Those warming temperatures will definitely be easy to feel as we've been in quite a cold and dry pattern. And then our system continuing to wrap some colder air around the backside, but a fairly wide swath of rain, and that is really the dominant feature. Now on into Saturday, we have a new low that develops here near the Prince William Sound, and so with that, we do expect the potential for some more snow. This low is a very tricky forecast at this point because if it moves just to the east of the Cook Inlet region, cold air comes around the backside, but if it's just to the west, warm air comes on the east side. And so that is going to dictate what type of precipitation. Is it going to be snow, rain and snow, or just all rain? So stay tuned to your Saturday forecast for those interested in the Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula for the weekend. Over towards southeast Alaska, we should see mostly snow over the higher elevations, but unfortunately for those snow lovers in the coastal areas near Juneau, Ketchikan, those places that just got some fresh snow last week, that is going to be turning to rain, and so we do expect some slick conditions to develop when you put rain down on a snowpack. That makes for pretty slick conditions for driving, so be advised of that on into Saturday and into Sunday. Our low is now moving north towards the Gulf, or towards the Bering Strait. And with that, we should see the snow showers pull away as well, just clipping the northwest coast there. And then our new area of low pressure at 948 millibars, another Bering storm starting to move in. We'll be watching this one quite closely. Could produce some strong winds for Atka and Adak, and then eventually we'll start to play into the forecast as we get into next week. So for temperatures today at 4 o'clock, we saw most of the panhandle still clear and cold. Temperatures mainly in the teens with some low 20s, but otherwise a pretty cool day there once again. Starting to see those temperatures rise throughout south central, 16 degrees at Cordova, 20 degrees at Valdez, and 39 degrees Middleton Island. Copper River Basin up about 13 degrees from this time yesterday, from minus 30 to minus 17. As we look towards the interior, 26 degrees at Fairbanks, so there's a pretty good warm up as well. Up over the Brooks Range, we saw anywhere between minus 15 and minus 13. And then over the Arctic coast, single digits for the most part. Seward Peninsula came in the mid to upper 20s. And over southwest Alaska, temperatures mainly in the low to mid 30s for the most part. Out over the Alaska Peninsula, temperatures climbed all the way up into the 40s, 38 degrees at Nelson Lagoon, and we had 40 degrees there at Dutch Harbor. So tonight's low temperatures, you can see over southeast Alaska, another clear night producing another round of the mid-teens, unless you're right along the coast there, 26 degrees. Over the Copper River Basin is still expecting minus 23 degrees for the overnight low. Be in the mid to low 20s for much of south central Alaska. Up towards the interior, expect just single digits. We're going to keep things above zero for a change for the interior portions. And until you get to the Brooks Range and then north of that, you can see temperatures drop below zero there for a little bit, but returning to above zero once you are along the Arctic coast. 29 degrees expected for Nome tonight, and Bethel should come in at 25 degrees, with the Alaska Peninsula generally in the mid to upper 30s. For tomorrow's high temperatures, we'll expect the southeastern portion of the state to be in the mid to upper 20s. For much of south central, we're going to see temperatures actually rise above freezing in some locations. Kenai expected to be 33, Homer expected to be 40 degrees, and 42 at Kodiak. So we're starting to see this flow switch around to the south, bringing in much warmer temperatures. Over the interior portions of the state, generally going to be in the single digits and the teens, and then up along the Brooks Range and the North Slope, expect single digits and maybe some teens up there as well. And then the west coast is where that warm air is really tracked in and have some of the winds, the stronger winds, helping to create friction, which then helps to induce warming as well. So mid 30s for the most part, and stretching all the way up into the 40s once you get out over the Alaska Peninsula. How's this going to impact our flying? Well, you can see here various components of those fronts are starting to create lower conditions for flying weather out over different portions of the state. So we have south central with a pocket of IFR, interior has a pocket of IFR, and then the Arctic coast with a pocket of IFR. The most continuous area is right along the next frontal boundary there, out over the western portion of the west coast. And this is for tomorrow morning. And then we have another pocket of IFR back here over the western portion of the Bering. Generally, MVFR conditions surrounding all the IFR, and the good flying weather remains out over southeast Alaska. Southeast, though, will deteriorate through the day tomorrow as that moisture starts to push in from the Gulf, so we do expect conditions to go downhill there, down to IFR conditions over the passes as we mentioned, and then pockets again of IFR depending on where the snow is. Snow generally helps to reduce visibility pretty significantly, especially these flakes. We expect them to be a little bit bigger in size with temperatures in the 20s. Generally you can get some big flakes at that temperature, and so thus easy to reduce visibility into the IFR range. So be advised if you are planning a trip in the air tomorrow. And Atuvik Pass is going to be VFR, so is Adigan, and Lake Clark and Merrill both are going to be IFR through the day under that southwest flow. Rainy Pass will deteriorate through the day from MVFR down to instrument flight rules. Windy will start out marginal visual flight rules, but then decrease to instrument flight rules. Isabel, same story there. Mentasta, we should see MVFR conditions throughout the day. And Tanita will be actually improving from IFR to MVFR as that one front moves off. Same story at Portage. And then again, Chilkoot and White both start off quite nice and then deteriorate through the day, probably not getting to IFR conditions until later in the night. So for our freezing levels, you can see here again, not quite as warm as they were yesterday, but still some warmer air being pushed up through the Gulf and a few pockets of 2,000-foot freezing levels out here over the Bering Sea. Mainly the interesting note is the surface line has been shoved to the north out over portions of Bristol Bay and southwest Alaska. So that warmer air certainly is making its influence felt throughout much of the southwest portion of the state, and then hugging again right along the surface there in southeast. So it's not going to take much, unfortunately, to push things over to rain once you get into southeast. For tomorrow's icing, generally above 4,000 feet associated with that moisture starting to push finally towards the Alcan border from much of southeast and the eastern portion of the mainland, and then above 6,000 feet with our next front over Kodiak. This is all light, isolated, moderate. Above 3,000 feet there up towards the Seward Peninsula as things are a little bit cooler up there. And then our biggest area stretching around that frontal system where the moisture is above 5,000 feet for much of the Bering Sea out over the Aleutians. What does our jet stream look like? Well, again, about 175 knots coming out of the due west. We call this a zonal jet when it moves from west to east or east to west, depending on your perspective. And those really can help to stimulate storms rather quickly, and those storms can usually ride along that jet for quite some time. If they separate from the jet, then they weaken rather quickly. So as we're seeing with these storms, they're building rather quickly, and then they separate to the north towards Russia, and then they weaken. So riding along that is our area of low pressure, and then the jet turns over this ridge over into the west coast at about 80 knots. A small finger supporting that energy that's moving over the Cook Inlet region tonight at about 70 knots. And then another area of the polar front jet diving down at 120 knots, coming underneath this stronger low off the west coast of the continental United States, and then coming in at 160 knots. How does that mean for our 9,000-foot winds? Well, again, our strongest area of winds is coming on the south side of this low, 65 knots, pretty stout jet there at 9,000 feet, and that turns pretty sharply from the south to the north at about 50 knots there along the west coast. So be advised, if you're trying to travel through those areas, there could be some pretty good turbulence in those locations. Out over the rest of the Gulf of Alaska, generally 40 knots out of the south, coming over top of this ridge of high pressure out over the North Pacific. And then for much of the state, just expect southerly flow, stronger along the west coast, and then fairly light towards the central portion of the state. And 3,000 feet, very similar in its pattern, generally coming out of the south over the Gulf at about 35 to 40 knots, coming over this ridge of high pressure down towards Dixon Entrance at about 15 knots. Over the mainland, fairly light once you're in the interior. Southwest, we do have some fingers stronger, especially right through the passes there, Lake Clark and Merrill Pass. Definitely could see about 45 knots out of the south-southeast, channeling through those areas. And then generally coming around this area of low pressure here, counterclockwise flow, 60 knots, becoming 50, and then 40 knots as you come out of the east, out over the Gulf of Vanadier. So what does that mean for our turbulence charts? Well, today was probably the worst of the 2 days. Tomorrow should be somewhat of an improvement, but still a fairly wide swath around this low pressure, around this front here. Below 4,000 feet, some light, isolated, moderate, and then a few pockets of occasional widespread moderate, especially right around the backside of that low where we see those stronger winds mixing in, and then where the winds interact with the terrain along the Aleutian Islands. That's where we also expect some light to isolated, occasional widespread moderate. Thanks for this portion, and we'll see you in a little bit for the marine forecast.
Touring the Rocky Planets. Hey there, stargazers. I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida.
And I'm Dean Regas, astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory, and we're here to help you find your way around the sky. The planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars have a few things in common.
They're all round, rocky objects, also called terrestrial planets, which are thousands of miles in diameter.
And they all circle relatively close to the Sun. Well, at least compared to the outer planets of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune.
Since they're rocky, that means you can actually stand on them.
You can, but some of them you wouldn't want to.
True. But early this week, you have the best chance of seeing 3 of the 4 terrestrial planets in the sky.
Let's show you. Okay, we have our sky set to December 15th at about 5:45 p.m., just after sunset. Timing is key to see the planet closest to the Sun. Do you see it over there in the southwest?
Low above the horizon, you might, just might, be able to make out the planet Mercury. It never strays far from the Sun and often shines with a pinkish hue.
Higher up in the southwest is a much brighter planet. In fact, it is the brightest planet you can see from Earth, other than the Earth.
That's Venus, and you've probably been seeing her every night after sunset for the past few months. And you'll still have a few more months to bask in Venus's dazzling glow before she heads out of the evening sky later in 2017.
Finally, even higher in the sky and farther to the south, you can find the red planet Mars. At 5:45, Mars might be tough to spot, but as we move towards 6 p.m. and 6:15, he will pop into view as Mercury sets.
From above the solar system, we can look at the inner planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars and see how they revolve around the Sun.
Mercury is the closest to the Sun and moves the fastest. Venus is second, Earth is third, and Mars is fourth.
The distance from the Sun determines how fast a planet will move and how long it takes to make one trip around the Sun. That's its year.
A year on Earth is about 365 days long, while a year on Mercury is only 88 days. James would be over 200 years old on Mercury.
Well, you young whippersnapper. Venus takes 225 days to circle the Sun, and a year on Mars is 687 days. That means Dean would be only 22 years old on Mars.
I'll take that.
Our best pictures of Mercury come from the Messenger spacecraft, which mapped almost the entire surface.
What we see on Mercury is a gray, dusty world, scarred by craters, craters, and more craters. In fact, Mercury looks a lot like our moon, showing the impacts of ancient collisions with meteoroids and comets.
Now, let me give you a tip. You would not want to visit the surface of Venus.
No way. It is hot, like 900 degrees Fahrenheit hot.
Venus's thick atmosphere traps in so much heat that the surface boils, and the atmosphere is heavy. The air pressure would actually squish you flat.
And then if it rains on Venus, watch out. It doesn't rain water, it rains sulfuric acid. So you'd be a roasted, squished, acidy pile of goop on Venus.
Now we're on Mars, and most of it looks like a dry orange desert. You can also find tall mountains like Olympus Mons, which is 3 times taller than any mountain on Earth, and deep valleys like Valles Marineris, which is 2,500 miles long and 5 times deeper than the Grand Canyon.
Plus, there's 2 rovers still rolling on Mars. Look, there's the Curiosity rover climbing Mount Sharp. Hey, Curiosity, it's us, James and Dehne. We may still be decades away from sending humans to Mars, but one can always dream. So, get outside this week just after sunset and look quickly for Mercury low in the southwest.
And take your time to see Venus and Mars higher up.
And even with the rocky Earth below your feet, you can always still reach for the planets as you keep looking up.
And welcome back for your marine forecast. So our sea surface temperatures, the only thing I really want to point out here is how much warm water has been pushed up towards St. Lawrence Island. And you can see that reflected more so here in the sea ice, where we've seen things deteriorate quite significantly over the last couple days. There was some sea ice south of St. Lawrence Island. There was some shore-fast ice south of Nunivak Island, and some more ice down here towards the Bristol Bay region. So a lot of this has opened up, has become broken ice now, and we do expect this to continue again as those strong southerly winds and that warm air is pumped up by these strong Bering storms. So those storms really large players in a lot of aspects of the weather that we're keeping an eye on for you. So into the marine forecast now for southeast Alaska. Fairly calm day on Friday with variable winds up towards Lynn Canal at about 10 knots, seas 2 feet, and then becoming southeast towards the southern portions of the inner waters, 10 to 15 knots, seas 2 to 3 feet. Out over the open waters, 8-foot seas and west winds at 20 knots. For Saturday, expect more of a southwest to westerly flow, increasing a little bit, 25 to 30 knots, and those seas will start to build between 13 and 16 feet out over the open waters. South and southeast winds 15 to 25 knots for the inner passageways, and seas 3 to 5 feet. Out over south central, expect the outer waters to be southerly winds to southwesterly winds, generally between 20 and 30 knots, seas between 11 and 25 feet. And then over the Prince William Sound region, 15 knots out of the east, 3-foot seas, and then becoming more northerly and then southeasterly towards the western Barren Islands, 15 to 30 knots through there, and seas generally between 6 and 11 feet. We do have enough ice coverage now that there's not going to be a whole lot of seas for the Cook Inlet and the northern portion of the Cook Inlet. Now into Saturday, we can see a little bit more confused flow over the open Gulf as those fronts move through, southwest becoming west and then southwest again, 25 knots, seas between 11 and 14 feet. Prince William Sound picking up pretty good as well, 25 knots out of the southeast, 4-foot seas, and then generally southwest and westerly flow up towards the Cook Inlet region, 20 knots and seas between 5 and 7 feet. For the Alaska Peninsula on Friday, you can expect southwest and southerly winds, 25 to 30 knots, and those seas are still going to be pretty high courtesy of that swell building in from those storms, so 15 to 20-foot seas out there, unless you're in the protected areas of Prince William Sound, Bristol Bay at 7 feet. And then on Saturday, you can expect southerly flow or southwesterly flow, 20 to 40 knots, stronger south of the Alaska Peninsula, and seas generally building between 9 and 18 feet. For the Aleutians, expect again those stronger winds of high 50 knot winds out there out of the west, courtesy of that low pressure system, and seas not anything to mess around with at 45 feet out there. So some pretty impressive seas and impressive winds, becoming more southwesterly, 35 to 45 knots, and generally between 25 and 35 foot seas. Again, pretty strong storm systems for the December time frame. And then on Saturday, expect things to become a little bit more southeasterly as that new area of low pressure develops down to the south, generally between 45 and 55 knots, and seas are going to be on the order of 20 feet for the Dutch Harbor area, but climbing all the way up to 45 feet once you get south of Atka and Adak. We'll be watching that area for the possibility of any high winds moving through there. For the west coast, generally southeasterly winds between 30 and 40 knots, and seas climbing up to 27 feet near the Pribilofs, and then dropping down a little bit lower up towards St. Lawrence Island. Don't expect as much freezing spray up there now with the warmer temperatures starting to move in. And then southeasterly winds generally and southerly winds 25 to 35 on Saturday, and seas between 15 and 25 feet. No seas for the Arctic coast as it's all iced in for the most part up there, but we'll keep an eye on that. Generally easterly winds 15 knots unless you're just north of the Seward Peninsula at 30 knots. And then again on Saturday, expect primarily easterly flow and southeasterly off the northwest coast, 15 to 25 knots. So recapping our weather tonight, we're expecting a little bit more snowfall to increase across south central up towards the Copper River Basin. It'll be rain right along the coast, and we do still see some of those blowing snow pockets along the west coast. Our freezing rain advisory, our one advisory for the southern end of the Seward Peninsula, does expire here in just a few minutes at 6 o'clock. And this storm system is really just going to continue to send more moisture towards the state on Friday, eventually pushing into southeast Alaska. Rain and snow for them as well on Friday. And then on Saturday, again, more moisture moves across, and we have our new area of low pressure developing, another strong system at 948 millibars. Thanks for watching tonight. Hope you have a great evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, sustaining Alaska's pipeline and its operations today and into the future.